What's the scariest thing you've ever seen in prison? Story 1. My cellmate was truly crazy and was tortured by hallucinations. One day he managed to gouge one of his eyes out with a fork at lunch in front of everyone, then puncture the other eye with something before the screws could get to him. He was screaming like a banshee when he ripped the first one out and threw it on the floor, and everyone just stared in shock, including the screws. At first it looked like a skit or something. After the one was out, he went really quiet and pulled something from his waist and started rapidly stabbing the other eye with it. I heard it pop. By that time a couple of screws were already just about with him and they took him down. Never saw him again after that, but I heard he was completely blind. So quite a few of us never finished lunch, and some got some counseling because it was so violent and shocking. I still remember a screw picking the eye up with a clear plastic bag while we were all being filled out. Story 2. Not me, but I spoke to a former inmate after his release who had developed severe PTSD from some of the things he witnessed while incarcerated. One of the stories was that he was playing cards with some guys and one of them was smoking a cigarette. Another inmate who was not playing with them approached the table and asked the guy smoking if he could get shorts on the cigarette. Shorts means, before you finished smoking, you gave the cigarette to someone else so they got the last few puffs of the cigarette before putting it out. The smoker agreed. The inmate wandered off, and they went back to playing cards. Well, the guy playing cards must have forgotten and finished the cigarette. A little while later the other inmate came back to the table asking for the shirt, and the guy at the table told him that he had forgotten about it and finished the cigarette. Guy wanders off again, and they go back to playing cards. Shortly afterwards, the inmate who wanted shorts comes back to the table, comes up behind the player, pulls his head back, and started shaking him in the eye and throat with a pen. Dude died over forgetting to give someone a damn cigarette butt. Story 3. The violence was nothing compared to the people. The guy who taught me Scrabble beat his wife to death with a frying pan when she discovered his gambling debts. The guy who taught me poker tied up his employer in his house, and when the boss refused to give him the combo to his safe, the guy just burned the house down with his boss tied inside. I worked out with a guy who was caught with 2 arms and 1 leg in his trunk. He was in an Asian gang, had just performed a hit and was bringing the evidence back to his people for proof when he was pulled over. His co-defendant was snitching, so he spent literally all of his time working out to the guy the second he got the chance. Before I got shipped to prison, these were all county jail. He finally got his shot and essentially ripped the guy's face off in the middle of a hallway in front of guards. It was a huge on the cops' part, to the point where it was rumored it was the gang that paid to make sure the snitch died. You live with these people, play cards, gamble, watch sports. If you're locked in your cell for a big game, you listen on your radios together and talk shit through the hatches in your doors. On Wednesdays your chicken quarter is gonna go towards a huge homemade meal for whoever wanted to chip in. And it's gonna be made by the 22-year-old creep who's been charged with 9 separate murders and is seemingly the nicest person you'll ever meet. It's wild, nothing makes sense, and everything's dangerous. You're in this together, but at the same time everyone has all sorts of rage just ready to blow. I had an egg assault with a deadly weapon, as well as a separate case of unlawful possession of a firearm. So I had the pleasure of going to max units. Interestingly enough, the threat of constant danger actually helped things stay calm, the vast majority of the time. Everyone's a killer, no one wants to be killed type vibes. I got stabbed with a Dixon pencil, but that was from Richard Busby. Mr. tied my boss up and burned him alive. It was over a gambling debt he owed me. He's old and weak. I ultimately took twice what he owed me, and we were back at the table playing poker together that same day. Google his name if you'd like. I believe he just had an appeal denied, or some shit. In JDOC, either you become one of them, or you live underneath them. And once you're one of them, they're surprisingly and frighteningly good-natured and decent to kill a few years' time. Story 4. When I was 20 years old, I thought I wanted to be a correctional officer. One night I was sent to work at the medical ward, where each inmate had their own isolated cell where they were let out twice a day. That night I was going around with the nurse giving the inmates their medicine, and we came to one inmate's cell, and as soon as we opened the door I was knocked back by the most putrid smell I have ever smelled in my life. I've been to the dump plenty of times in my life, and it was nothing in comparison to the smell this inmate was going on. Once we were done giving out the medicine, I went up to the officer training me and asked him what was going on with that inmate and why he smelled so god-awful. He said, "Oh, you met Grady. He shits and pisses himself on purpose. He never changes or showers, so he constantly lives in his own filth. I found out that he was raped once in prison. So he started shitting and pissing himself so he wouldn't be raped anymore." Edit. This was in a jail I worked at. I guess I should have specified that at the beginning. The other officers told me that he was raped while he was previously in prison. I don't know why he was in jail when I was there, but the officers said he was a convicted child molester, so I'm assuming it pertained to that. He did have his own room. He was in the medical ward. He was in the safest place he could be at the time. The medical ward was for people that have medical issues, drug detoxation, and psychiatric issues. They're separated from the general population. Every now and then they would make him take showers. The inmate workforce would have to wear hazmat suits to clean his room while he was taking a shower, so it wasn't just him that smelled. His whole living quarters smelled. Even though he was forced to take showers, he would continue to use the bathroom on himself. There's no excuse for child molestation, but I felt bad for him in a sense because he talked like a little kid. Like when a child has a speech impediment, and they'll say wabbit instead of rabbit. He definitely seemed to have development issues. Story 5. Brixton, A-Wing. Coming back from canteen, this scary-looking wild-eyed dude steps across and tells me to hand over my tobacco. I laugh and say no and walk by, waiting for him to do something. Nothing happened. A few minutes later, same guy opened some Polad's stomach with one slash, and he was lying there trying to hold his intestines. I saw the fear and panic on his face. The scary guy just casually walked away. No idea what happened to either of them. Alarms went off. Everyone back to their cells and locked up again. Story 6. This happened on my 6th day of my only time ever in jail. While waiting for my arraignment in Harris Co. Jail, Texas, I'm sitting on the concrete floor reading a book, and a fight breaks out. I'm between two bunks, and the fight ends up in that slot with me. I couldn't move because the crowd of guys watching was blocking my way. I sat there, as one guy bashed another guy head repeatedly into the concrete floor. Blood gushing, and the dude was limp after the second bash, but it went in for way too long, 1 foot away from me. The gurgling, spastic breathing sounds he was making were awful. 2 years, in a federal facility, a new guy was being walked into the tank. Apparently he was the wrong kind of Mexican, and less than a minute after he walks in with the guard, 6 guys jump him. The guard, knowing he's outnumbered, steps back and calls support. Within 30 seconds, the dude did not have a face. We were allowed padlock to lock our stuff up, and these guys came swinging with padlocks and socks. We were on lockdown for 2 days after that. But the worst, like others have shared, is hearing a guy get raped. I don't know what this guy did, but the 4 dudes walked into his cell, the silly walks out, and the screams were haunting. Story 7. A white kid gets absolutely destroyed for accidentally sitting on the front bench of the TV area on his 2nd day. They waited for rec, then started walking with him. Every lap they made, more guys would tag along. Then once in the blind spot, they jumped him. 6 to 7 guys beating a 120-pound skinny little white kid. They were climbing up the fence and jumping down on his head. He was out within the first few seconds, but they kept on beating him until the cuz gassed everyone. They snapped his lower back, and he is now in a wheelchair. All for not knowing any better. The worst thing I've ever heard was a grown man being raped one night. He refused to pay a protection fee, and 3 dudes raped him. They stabbed him in the ass with a toothbrush shank. I've seen some crazy shit, but theirs were the most memorable. Sometimes I have nightmares about the rape. I've never heard anything like that ever since. Story 8. I was in the Lawrenceville Penitentiary in VA from 2011 to 2014. From a penitentiary standpoint, it was quite accommodating. They had all the drugs, alcohol, cigs, and cell phones you could ever dream of. I was working in the kitchen towards the middle of my bit, making myself an egg sandwich one morning. This young dude got into a dispute with a dude everybody knew as Unc, who by the way was a super quiet guy who didn't mess with anyone. They were apparently arguing over a cigarette, when the young buck called Unc a bitch. Unc grabbed an institution can of green beans, baseball, pitched it across the kitchen, and nailed young buck in the face. Unc ran over to a young buck, picked the can back up and beat him across the face with it. When he was done ripping young buck's face off with that can, he spit on him and said that's what happens when you call a real man a bitch. That was the last time I ever called any man a bitch. I learned so much about respect in them. I haven't been to prison in over 4 years. I have also been sober since then too. Thank you, Unc. I hope you are well. Story 9. I did a 4-month stint in Kajang, Malaysia. This Nigerian dude used to pilfer from other cells. This Malay gang found him and dipped his hand in boiling oil, basically deep-fried it while it was still attached to him. That scream, it still curdles my blood. Po guy was reduced to an unconscious pool of blood, sweat, tears, vomit, shit, and piss. He lost more than his hand on that day. Story 10. Sword dude get his head caved in his cell. A new inmate had come in and refused to show his papers. Another inmate came and said he was in court with him and he was a pedophile. Later that day, the keys, as we called them, told him he needed to roll his shit up. Basically asked for protective custody. He refused. Later that night after we were all in our cells, his cellie took a pencil and stabbed him in the eye. Then pulled him off his bunk and smashed his head against the wall till there was nothing left. Once he was done, he called the co over the intercom and let them handle everything. I could see this through our window as they were in the cell across from us. Story 11. Inmates being denied medical treatment until they are dead. I saw it twice. Both were diabetics, both elderly, neither had family support, and both had conditions exacerbated by the inhumane housing situation. In the South Texas heat, they lock up 56 men per dorm in poorly ventilated metal buildings. On lockdown, they require you to stay in your bunk on a plastic mattress for weeks, only allowed a 5-minute shower every third day. I was 40 and in decent shape, and I thought I might die there. In the afternoons, the wall next to me was so hot I couldn't leave my hand on it. Shame on TDCJ and all of the employees. They put people in a terrible situation, and we allow it to continue. If they treated dogs like that, there would be pitchforks. End of rant. Story 12. My brother said a guy across from him had a new cellmate who had gastrointestinal problems and wouldn't stop farting these rancid, horrible farts after the guy told him repeatedly to stop. So the guy beats the father to death in their cell with his bare hands. My brother said he had never seen so much blood from one person before. Story 13. Not a crazy story, but was in for a few days and didn't realize they put you in cells based on the color of your skin. I'm a white dude with a Hispanic last name, and they put me in a cell with a straight Nazi who told me if I went to actual prison, that I would be a misfit because I wasn't one thing or the other. He openly called the black dudes next to our cell horrible things. Story 14. Not an ex-con, but prison admin staff. Right before I started working there, a man was on a classification override at my facility, meaning he was too dangerous to be in this prison, but got to be there for some reason. He was psychotic and talking nonsense to his 2 cellmates when all of a sudden he screamed he was the devil and gouged out a man's eyes while the other cellmate was frantically hitting the emergency button. Responding staff had mandated in-house therapy as a result. Horrific. Another was when I was working. A young man in for gang stuff brutally beat to death an old man who was just admitted for child crimes. Turns out the man raped this kid's younger sister. They didn't have the same last name, and she wasn't listed in the classification stuff, so no one knew. Responding staff said his head was kicked in so hard it was unrecognizable and had a consistency of jello. Story 15. I work in jails across the country. There are many unsettling moments. Violence between inmates, suicide, psychosis. One day I was helping a doctor. When she's helping her patients, I try and stay out of the room so that way I'm not interfering with her work. For some reason, the specific patient that she was working with had stuck out in my mind before. Though I see hundreds a day during med pass, where I follow a nurse from cell to cell, I specifically remember seeing this man. He was relatively young and very polite, which is what stuck out at me. He always said, "Hello ma'am, how are you, thank you please," etc. I remember looking at the chart to see what his name was. I rarely remember names. I actually feel it is better not to. Anyways, I'm standing in the hallway outside the doctor's office when another patient who is sitting on the bench waiting to be seen says to me, "Stay away from that person. He's a crazy imp." I laughed. See it as one inmate telling me to stay away from another inmate. I don't even let anybody stand behind me or within 5 feet of me. My laughing changed his tone. He got a lot more serious. His voice raised in intensity. "No, I am serious. Stay away from them. He is crazy." Okay. Point taken. I nod my head, and at that moment, am thankful for the COVID masks that hide my reaction. Not a moment later, the corrections officer comes waltzing down the hallway swinging his keys in his hand and whistling. "Oh, hey, that's Body Bag Lag." Name slightly changed for privacy. My eyes immediately widened. I googled him later. That man had a... She got pregnant. She didn't let him see the baby when it was born. He wanted custody. He and his damn plan and successfully executed all 10 of her family members, anyone who could possibly get the baby before he would receive custody. And maybe I'm misremembering, but I think it worked. I believe he had custody of the kid for a while until he himself came forward and confessed and threw his whole family under the bus and accepted his punishment. I think he became super religious, or maybe the guilt got to him. I remember his cell always had 100 crosses taped to the walls. I've had scarier moments in jail. Whole cells having to go on lockdown because they see a girl working. A lot of people jerk off at you. But Body Bag Lag will always stick out to me.